National Signing Day today. There are all sorts of winners and losers. Florida and Florida State really had a rough one. Oregon picked up some wins. Auburn picked up some wins. I know keeping some of the guys that you thought might be flippers shouldn't be necessarily viewed as a win, but for some schools, it's viewed as a win of keeping the guys that you had worked that hard for your entire recruiting cycle to then at the last minute keep them with you. Probably isn't viewed as this all-time great victory in the recruiting battles, but sometimes that's a win. But that leads me to my next question, and that is, in the era of college football that we're in the transfer portal being as prevalent as it is, and it is very prevalent, and it is frequently used as evidenced by the 1,500 players or whatever that number is that are in the transfer portal between the end of the season and now. How important are recruiting rankings? I'm never going to be a guy that sits here and says, oh, recruiting rankings don't matter. Stars don't matter, because they do. Teams that are fighting for spots in the national championship game or in the upper echelons of the sport aren't finishing 45th in the recruiting rankings. There's a reason that it coincides that teams that have really good players play football real good. It doesn't take a science rocket to figure that out. The teams that have the best players do the best in the sport. So I'm not going to sit here and say the general recruiting tropes of, one, that kid is only that highly rated because he's being recruited by insert school here. Number two, of recruiting stars don't matter. It's about development. While that could be true, the idea that you're going to move from 78th in the recruiting rankings to winning your Power 5 conference isn't that likely. It just doesn't happen. And that's okay, but it shows how important recruiting is. On the flip side, now that we've got to this spot where, for the most part, if you are disappointed today that your school didn't get this guy or that guy, there's a 50-50 chance that you could get him next year when he enters the transfer portal. And if not next year, in 2 years. And if not in 2 years, in 3 years, you could get that guy back on your team via the transfer portal. That's how likely it is that those things change and those guys transfer. And so I wonder if there is a spot where you have to get to, okay, there are recruiting rankings and then transfer portal rankings of who got better through the portal, who got better in recruiting. Because they're not really apples to apples. And maybe there's a roster management or a roster turnover rankings or whatever the case may be. A yearly talent rankings, because there's just so much flux, so much change in college football rosters that you can say, you can't project out today the who finishes. You actually probably could, but for sake of the argument, you can't project out who is going to win the 2026 or 2027 national title by who finishes in the top 5 to 10 in the recruiting rankings anymore. It used to be, if you could stockpile 3 really good classes, that team, man, look out for Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, USC, Oklahoma, Texas, whoever, Notre Dame. If they put 3 really good classes together, you were going to be able to say, look out for that team down the line in the BCS, look out for that team down the line in the college football playoff. Now, you can still do that because the blue bloods, the established programs, the teams that are hot right now are going to stay the established programs, the blue bloods, the teams that are hot right now. So they're still going to get good recruits. They're still going to be a destination for kids in the transfer portal. But your path to still being really great at the sport doesn't strictly lie with being really good at recruiting the high school ranks. It used to be almost like programs were kind of looked down upon if they recruited in the JUCO ranks, or somebody wanted to transfer and sit out a year, but they were going to accept a transfer. Like Kansas State got to be really good under Bill Snyder because, and it makes a lot of sense, there are a boatload of JUCOs in Kansas. Okay, well, you get all these guys to this state, you might as well keep them here after playing at a JUCO for a year or two. And they never really got the respect that they deserved because, yeah, but I mean, they're just recruiting JUCO kids. And so I think there are still going to be, like, there's still some of that. I think a little bit in college football of like, okay, Lane Kiffin's doing a really great job at Ole Miss, but they get a lot of transfers, a lot of NIL deals for their high school recruits. I guess I don't understand why there is why there's almost like a hint of cynicism around the way people build their rosters. Nonetheless, when you look at recruiting rankings today, and maybe this is how it's always been, it's just now really starting to get to the forefront of how many guys in an 18-person recruiting class are going to finish their careers where they signed today. How many guys in a 25-man recruiting class are going to 100%, without a doubt, be at the program, finish their college careers where they're signing today? That number's not that high. So I'm not saying that recruiting rankings aren't important, because I think they are. I think having really highly regarded players, high stars in your classes is still overwhelmingly important. But is it as important as keeping those guys? I don't think so. And it used to be, you'd get to this situation where you get this group of 25 guys in a recruiting class, and the expectation is, 10 to 12 to 15 of them become really solid contributors for you. You get some depth guys, some guys who end up, being scout team guys, and on senior day, they get recognized for sticking it out. But now, for as volatile and as wide open as a player movement apparatus as there is, you can now look to, okay, in a class of 25 guys, if we can get 8 of those guys to be 8 to 10 to 12 of those guys to be solid contributors, and if the other half of those guys stay, transfer, whatever, we're still all right. It's a somewhat dramatic shift, but the turnover is just so apparent, so frequent, that I don't know that there's a way to adequately look at recruiting rankings today for the class of 2024, and have that really mean a whole lot in 2026. At some schools, yes. At some schools, they're going to do a really good job of keeping their guys, and the schools that prioritize, we're going to build through high school recruiting, etc. It matters a little bit, but that's, you're not on an even playing field, and you're not being viewed the same way as other schools who are going to be active as all get out in the transfer portal. It's just not an apples to apples thing. Now, it's never been apples to apples, that it's not really fair to view Alabama, Oklahoma, USC, Ohio State, Texas, Notre Dame, Florida, Georgia, whoever, on the same recruiting playing field as UMass and UConn and Akron and Southern Mississippi. It's just not, it's not apples to apples. But it is at least kind of measuring the success of these 1 through 130 plus teams. How'd you do? But I don't know how much stock you can put into those recruiting rankings anymore. You can say that today, yes, and I think it depends on how you look at it. If you're looking at it as today, the way that recruiting experts have put labels and expectations on the kids that you are signing today, and if that is how you're measuring it, sure, there's still a quantifiable way to point to, this is how we're grading these recruiting classes. But if you're projecting them out of what these guys are going to be, how they're going to impact the programs that they're going to, what that means for the futures of the top 10 teams in the recruiting rankings, the top 10 to 25 to 100 players in America, I don't think you can judge that today. And not just because you're going to get some right and you're going to get some wrong, but that situation is likely to change before that player is done with their college football career. And that's an important part of their story and their journey in the sport, is how good of a fit it was for you out of high school, whether your coaches stayed, whether your position coach stayed, whether your coordinator stayed, whether your head coach stayed, and who they brought in to compete with you via high school, via transfer portal. And there are guys today that are making decisions that are based on NIL that are going to come to realize, like, I made a mistake. I should not have done what I did. There are guys that, and I think, and it's okay because your priorities change in life, right? Like what I wanted to be when I grew up, when I was 10, changed to when I was 18, and then when I was 22, and then when I was 25, and now that I'm working on 35, your priorities change, and that's okay. But some guys will enter their college careers thinking, like, this is badass that I'm going to get paid to play college football, and I'm getting paid a lot of money. And then after a year or two go, you know what? Money's nice, but you know what's also a lot of fun is winning or being developed to have a chance to go to the NFL. So there are guys that are making mistakes today. It's just the reality of the situation. There's probably a lot of guys that are making a mistake today by signing who they're going to sign with. They just don't know it yet. And that's part of growing up. That's part of college football too. So you can lump some of those, like I don't think you can project who's making a mistake. Like, I don't want to see projections of like, okay, this guy's a 5-star, this guy's a 4-star, but that 4-star is going to be a 5-star someday when he transfers to this school due to an NIL bag. Like, I don't want to get into guys who are like, this guy's going to be a primo guy to be a transfer. Like we talked about Dylan Raiola. I don't want to sit here and denigrate like high school kids. I don't think that's fun. And if that's your thing, we can't be friends. If you're going to hate on kids that are because the college you decide to go to is going to be a ginormous factor in your future. Like for a lot of these dudes, like who you end up marrying or the kids you're going to have are dependent on what decision you make today. That's a lot. Like your future career, whether it's in the NFL or whether you're working for the city dump, hinges on the decision you made today. That's a lot to put on a kid. And some people are going to get that wrong. That's okay. As long as you come around to figuring it out later, that's what matters. But if you're enticed by an NIL bag and your priorities change, that's okay. But that's going to have an effect on the overall success of a program farther on down the line, other than just you can look back today at whoever finishes number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if 40% of those kids transfer, I don't know that you should be held to the standard of, okay, we had the number 1 recruiting class in 2023. That should lead to on-field success, right? Well, no, there's way more variables to that than I think the average person, I think people are starting to come around to it, but I think it's a difficult thing to grasp of, like, you should walk down that line, right? Like, okay, we finished at the top of the recruiting rankings. Therefore, in 2 years, it's similar to like baseball prospects, right? If you have the best prospect pool in baseball or a top 5 prospect pool in baseball, that's essentially saying you might suck now, but in 4 to 5 years, you should be pretty good. But if you get guys that you trade away or somebody doesn't work out or somebody gets an injury or whatever, things aren't linear and there are changes. And just now college football is in a spot where there are a lot of changes, to the point where I wonder just how important and effective the recruiting rankings are. Today, if you are looking at them in a vacuum, yes, you can look at them and say, this school did really well, this school did really well, this school got somebody that we didn't think they were going to get, and that moves them up the rankings, and this school didn't finish very strong. But when push comes to shove in 2 to 3 years, I don't think it's fair to look back on what happened on December 20th, 2023 and say, well, they should have been better because of their recruiting rankings. There's just too much stuff that goes into it now to look at this one aspect, I think. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Tomorrow, we might talk about who are the winners and losers of National Signing Day, because there were some winners and there were some losers. And I don't know that you want to see your team on the losers list. And I think there are some fan bases that know that every coach is going to say, we got our guy, but I don't know that everybody got their guy on Wednesday. We'll chat about that tomorrow here on the Daily Huddle with Saturday Glory. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out here at Saturday Glory. If you are listening on a podcast, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. We'll see you here on Thursday here on the Daily Huddle with Saturday Glory.